provocative and sometimes disturbing things about this issue, actually. And I don't think we talk about his teachings about these issues nearly enough. They're all taken from the complete works. And I thought that we could spend some time today thinking about what Swami Vivekananda says about true belief in God. What does it mean to truly believe in God, truly believe that God exists? What does it mean to have genuine faith in God? How do we know? What's the real test that we really believe in God? And how do we know that we're making progress in spiritual life? How do we know that we're moving forward in our journey of faith, in our journey of spiritual life? These are the kinds of questions that I want to raise today. What I'll be talking about today is based on chapter 8 of my latest book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, which is more academic and detailed and scholarly. And so if you want more details on this stuff, please look at chapter 8 of my book on Vivekananda. So first of all, to kind of just give a summary of my overall understanding of how Swami Vivekananda understands our journey of faith. I think he says that our journey of faith consists in 3 main stages. In fact, we can call it his faith ladder. Does anyone know the phrase faith ladder? Have any of you heard of it? Faith ladder. No? William James, the great philosopher at Harvard, he came up with this idea of the faith ladder, and he had his own sequence of stages. It's this long, I don't know, like 8, they're different. He had different versions of the faith ladder. Like sometimes there are 8 stages, sometimes there are more or less. And Swami Vivekananda, of course, had met William James at Harvard in the 1890s, had extended conversations with him. There was some mutual influence on both sides, and James was definitely influenced by Swami Vivekananda. He acknowledged it in his book Pragmatism and in other places. But in any case, we can, using James's language, we can talk about Swami Vivekananda's faith ladder. So what are the 3 rungs in this faith ladder? First rung. So when we start out in spiritual life, what's really striking is that Swami Vivekananda says, contrary to, I think, the mainstream view, is that spiritual life, religious life, does not begin with belief in God. He says that's a widespread notion, but it's mistaken. He says the vast majority of people begin with what he calls intellectual assent to God's existence. Intellectual assent to God's existence. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. Most of us are stuck there, unfortunately. We're trying to move to the second stage, which is genuine belief that God exists, true belief that God exists. I believe that God exists. That's actually a very high stage of spiritual development, which most of us, we don't think about it that way. We think that, yeah, we start spiritual life with a belief and then you try to realize God. But no, Swami Vivekananda says the vast majority of spiritual aspirants are at stage 1, which is not belief, but intellectual assent. After a lot of spiritual practice in the course of many lifetimes, we can ascend to the second stage, which is genuine belief in God's existence. But even that's not the end. Because, of course, as Vedantins, we know that the goal cannot be faith. It cannot even be belief. It has to be direct spiritual realization of the divine. So that's the third and final stage, the culminating stage of our journey of faith. I know with absolute certainty that God exists because I have directly realized the divine. So that in a nutshell is the journey, on my understanding, my interpretation of Swami Vivekananda's views on this issue. And so let's start with stage 1. Some of these things might be frightening. That's why I said it's kind of provocative, these statements. And so I should, these days, I think people give trigger warnings. And so let me give a little trigger warning here that don't be frightened. What does Swami Vivekananda say about intellectual assent? How does he define it? And how is it different from belief in God? He says the following: this is one great idea to learn and to hold on to, this idea of realization. Only the man who has actually perceived God and soul has religion. There is no real difference between the highest ecclesiastical giant who can talk by the volume, and the lowest, most ignorant materialist. We are all atheists. Let us confess it. Mere intellectual assent does not make us religious. Not 1 in 20 millions is a real Christian. And as I said, startling, disturbing, provocative stuff. And he's not just picking on Christians here. In India, he'll say the same thing, except he'll say not 1 in 20 millions is a real Vedantin. It's not just about Christians. It's not that Hindus are somehow truer believers, have greater faith. No, across the board, throughout the world, most spiritual aspirants are not at the stage of belief. They assent intellectually to God's existence, but they don't yet believe. And in a sense, then, most spiritual aspirants are still atheists. He uses the word, we are all atheists, let us confess it. Let us confess it is interesting, because the idea here is most of us don't confess it. We deceive ourselves, and we think that we're much more advanced than we really are from a spiritual standpoint. We think we're much further on the journey of faith than we actually are. And this is one of the greatest dangers in spiritual life. So to flesh out what he means, again, by intellectual assent, let's look at a few more quotations. Another one, this is from his talk, The Love of God. Religion nowadays has become a mere hobby and fashion. People go to church like a flock of sheep. They do not embrace God because they need God. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. Let's dwell on that sentence again. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. The ego is deeply invested in making us think that we're further along in the spiritual path than we really are. That's why the ego is so tricky, actually. One of the most dangerous forms of ego is spiritual ego, actually. And so especially when we first embark on the spiritual path, we first get initiated, I call it the honeymoon, the spiritual honeymoon period. Wow, when we already think we're having realizations and everything is great. And that's the greatest danger in a way. Because we think that we got the initiation, we got the mantra, and so I'm just few months away from God realization, from realization of the divine, from self-realization, whatever you want to call it. Most persons are unconscious atheists who self-complacently think that they are devout believers. I think that's what Swami Medhananda means. This, anyone who knows something about Western philosophy and theology might remind you what he's saying here of Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish Christian philosopher, because he says a lot of similar things. In Denmark in the 1800s, he noticed that most Christians who would go to church, they're not there for God. They're there for every reason but God, for socializing, for gossiping, for this, meeting their future mate, but not for God. And so he distinguished Christendom from Christianity, Kierkegaard, and said that most people this is Christendom. It's a kind of social Christianity, a cultural Christianity, but it's not spiritual. It's not a spiritual Christianity, which is the essence of Christianity. So the same things can be said about all the different religions, actually, and the believers in the different religions. Another passage from Vivekananda's complete works. He says, the vast majority of men, here, whenever he says men, this is late 19th century, so just people. The vast majority of people are atheists. I am glad that in modern times, another class of atheists has come into existence in the Western world. I mean the materialists. They are sincere atheists. They are better than the religious atheists. Very striking language. They are better than the religious atheists who are insincere, who fight and talk about religion, and yet do not want it. Never try to realize it. Never try to understand it. Remember the words of Christ. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. These words are literally true, not figures or fiction. Who wants God? That is the question. Do you think that all this mass of people in the world want God and cannot get him? that cannot be. So another dimension that he adds in this passage, which is quite striking, is he favors the materialistic atheists, the T.H. Huxleys of the world. I mean, this is in his time. Nowadays, we'd say, what? Richard Dawkins, who writes books called The God Delusion, and so on. You can, who's the other one? Christopher Hitchens, these kinds of people, yeah. Swami Vivekananda, if he were alive now, he'd prefer them to the religious atheists. What does he mean by religious atheists? People who cry themselves hoarse about religion and God, and yet they live their lives just like any ordinary materialist does, except for troubling other people and proselytizing. And it's striking, I think, that he quotes Jesus here. Ask and it shall be opened. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Seek and ye shall find. Way back, now I'm starting to feel old. I don't feel old, I don't want to say that. I am old. I'm 43. Maybe that's not old. That's up to you guys. But anyway, I used to be not so, I used to be much younger. So in my undergrad days, I spent a year at Oxford, and I was really interested in studying the world's religious scriptures. I was agnostic, but a kind of spiritual seeker at the same time. So an agnostic spiritual seeker, reading the Bible, reading parts of the Quran, reading Dhammapada, reading Bhagavad Gita, arguing with my friends of different persuasions, some of whom were atheists, some were agnostic. One good friend of mine at the time at Oxford was Christian. And he gave me a beautiful book, C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, and we'd have long discussions about Christianity and stuff like that. And in that context, I told him, I said, you know, Christ said, and I quoted the same thing that Swamiji quoted, ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. I said, I'm knocking, but I'm not getting any answer. And I see now, looking back on my younger self, that it was presumptuous of me to think that I was actually knocking. Knocking is not such an easy thing. Knocking is not just about an intellectual inquiry, intellectual curiosity. It's deep longing for God, for the divine. Do we really have that? How badly do we really need God or want God? That's the question. Of course, I didn't. I still don't. I'm working on it. So, what is intellectual assent then? This first stage in our spiritual journey, it's intellectual assent, not belief. Intellectual assent means what? It means we're intellectually open to the possibility that God exists. Where we are convinced that it's possible that God exists. And if we're sincere spiritual aspirants, we will want to believe that God exists. Okay, we'll get to that more in a second. Because this first category is very broad. Many people fall under this category. We'll talk about the different kinds of people. But the key difference between intellectually assenting to God's existence, which is the first stage, and truly believing that God exists, which is the second stage, is the following. Swami Vivekananda says, you can judge a person's beliefs by their behavior. That's the basic principle. That's the basic test. Just observe a person in his or her day-to-day life. And on the basis of what he or she does, what he or she says, what she or she thinks, you can figure out what his or her beliefs are. Because we necessarily act in accordance with our beliefs. To give you a simple example, I'm walking across the street. Suddenly, I believe that a huge truck is hurtling towards me. Do I really believe it? If I did believe it, what would I do? I would run for my life, right? Try to get to the other side of the road, run away from the truck so I don't get run over, right? So if you really believe that God exists, how would we live? Could we really live the way that we're living now, in this comfortable, hunky-dory way? Or will we spend every waking breath trying to realize the divine, that we really believe exists? So Vivekananda says, those who merely assent intellectually to God's existence, they don't live as if God exists. They live more or less ordinary lives, but with the added unfortunate element of hypocrisy. That's why that's why he prefers materialistic atheists to religious atheists. The ones who talk a lot about God, but if you observe their day-to-day life, who they truly are, you'll find that their behavior is not reflected in that belief. So intellectual assenters, they live more or less their lives as if God does not exist. That's the key difference between those who believe and those who just assent intellectually to God's existence. But as I said, this first category, this first stage is very, very broad. It includes both sincere spiritual aspirants and insincere spiritual aspirants, both kinds. Okay, and all of them are intellectual assenters. None of them are at the stage of belief. An insincere intellectual assenter at stage 1 is somebody who actually doesn't believe in God, but who has convinced him or herself that he or she does. That's that self-complacence that Swami Vivekananda is talking about. Because the ego, as I said, is deeply invested in making us think that we're much further along than we really are. So that's the insincere spiritual aspirant. And so therefore, so what happens if you become complacent? It means I don't have to exert myself anymore. I'm more or less there. I can just cruise now. You know, Sri Ramakrishna gives this example of a guy on a boat, and there's a storm. And so what does he do? He has to make all sorts of preparations. He has to set the sail in the right direction, and he's hard at work getting the ship ready. Until what? Until he takes advantage of the current based on what he does. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, then he can lie back and have a smoke. And he says, so in the beginning of spiritual life, we have to exert ourselves tremendously. We have to engage constantly in spiritual practice. Only at a very high stage, can we sit back and smoke the hookah. It's a very high level thing. It's a kind of surrender, right? That's why another example of Sri Ramakrishna's, he says, another boat example. He was fond of oceans and boats. So he said, imagine a bird sitting on the mast of a ship. The bird starts getting restless. So what does it do? It flies very, very far in the northern direction. Doesn't find anything particularly exciting or attractive. Flies all the way back to the mast. Does the same thing in the east. And then again, it can't sit still. So it goes to the west and then south. And then what? Finally, it sits on this mast and says, I've had enough of flying. That's surrender. That comes at the end of many lifetimes of spiritual struggle, spiritual practice. So the sincere spiritual aspirant is the person who is honest with herself. That's the first step, is just being honest with yourself. Where do I really stand now? Do I really believe in God? Or do I just assent intellectually to God's existence? And if I can honestly say, wait, I'm not there yet. I don't yet believe. I can't honestly say that. But I'm going to try. I'm going to do my best to try to believe that God exists by trying to live my life in a God-centered, in a divine-centric way. That's a sincere spiritual aspirant. So if we are a sincere spiritual aspirant in stage 1, what do? We engage sincerely in different kinds of spiritual practice, whatever we prefer. In Vedanta, there are 4 main yogas: Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, Raja Yoga, right? The path of knowledge, the path of devotion, the path of meditation, the path of selfless action. By one or more or all of these, Swami Medhananda used to say, be free and attain the goal of life. So take your pick or combine them. Ultimately, what should happen? If we're doing everything right, by God's grace, eventually a belief in God, the belief in God, will spontaneously arise in our hearts. Notice the language I'm using. I'll explain why in a second. Eventually, we will come to believe that God exists. And only when we do that do we ascend to stage 2 in our journey of faith. How does Swami Vivekananda explain this second stage, this very high stage in our spiritual journey? It's a long passage, but it's very, very, it's full of insight. So I think it's worth dwelling on it. He begins by saying, a great sage used to say, The sage here, well, let me quiz you after I read what the sage says. We'll see who the sage is, see if you know. A great sage used to say, suppose there is a thief in a room, and somehow he comes to know that there is a vast mass of gold in the next room, and that there is only a thin partition between the two rooms. What would be the condition of that thief? He would be sleepless. He would not be able to eat or do anything. His whole mind would be on getting that gold. Do you mean to say that if all these people really believed that the mine of happiness, of blessedness, of glory were here, they would act as they do in the world without trying to get God? That's what the sage says. Who is the sage? Any guesses? Yeah. Yeah, Sri Ramakrishna. What makes this tough, the question tough, is that most people have read the gospel or parts of the gospel, but it's not in the gospel. It's in Sharadananda's biography of Sri Ramakrishna. So yeah, it's Sri Ramakrishna, the great sage. So let me continue. Swami Vivekananda continues. As soon as a person begins to believe there is a God, he becomes mad with longing to get to him. Others may go their way, but as soon as a man is sure that there is a much higher life than that which he is leading here, as soon as he feels sure that the senses are not all, that this limited material body is as nothing compared with the immortal, eternal, undying bliss of the self, capital S, he becomes mad until he finds out this bliss for himself. And this madness, this thirst, this mania is what is called the awakening to religion. And when that has come, a man is beginning to be religious. But it takes a long time. And he continues. All these forms and ceremonies, these prayers and pilgrimages, these books, bells, candles, and priests are the preparations. They take off the impurities from the soul. And when the soul has become pure, it naturally wants to get to the mine of all purity, God himself. Just as a piece of iron, which had been covered with the dust of centuries, might be lying near a magnet all the time and yet not be attracted by it. But as soon as the dust is cleared away, the iron is drawn by the magnet. So when the human soul, covered with the dust of ages, impurities, wickednesses, and sins, after many births, becomes purified enough by these forms and ceremonies, by doing good to others, loving other beings, its natural spiritual attraction comes. It wakes up and struggles towards God. That's the passage. This second analogy involving the magnet and the iron, who used this analogy? Does this strike any? Also Sri Ramakrishna. This is actually from the gospel, so it's a little bit easier, but still impressive. Thank you. Not to diminish you. So yes, another analogy of Sri Ramakrishna's. And he's really milking these analogies and kind of plumbing their philosophical depths. So the first one, the thief. He says, imagine that you're a professional thief and a good thief, and there's a priceless treasure next door. There's just a tiny little wall separating you from that treasure. What would you do? Wouldn't you try to spend every waking breath trying to figure out how to break into that room? Of course you would. Of course you would. How many of us feel that way for God? If we really believed that this mine of blessedness, that the all-perfect, all-blissful is right there, right in our grasp, wouldn't we spend every waking effort trying to reach it? So he says that the true test of belief in God is longing for God. If we really believe that God exists, we would be full of longing. Sri Ramakrishna would use the term in Bengali, makulata, vyakulata in Sanskrit. It's actually a very, very high stage in spiritual development. In Advaita Vedanta, there's what's called sadhana chatushtaya, fourfold sadhana. Viveka, discrimination between what's real and unreal, what's permanent and impermanent. Vairagya, intense dispassion toward worldly attachments, worldly pleasures. Shat Sampat, the 6 treasures of spiritual life. I'm not going to go through all of them, but sense control, control of mind, and so on and so forth. Preventing the mind from going outward. And finally, the 4th prerequisite is mumukshutva, intense longing for liberation. And so the devotional bhakti equivalent of mumukshutva in Advaita Vedanta would be what Sri Ramakrishna calls vyakulata, intense longing to realize the divine. And how many of us really have that? That's the question that he's raising, using this analogy. Now, the second analogy he uses, also from Sri Ramakrishna, adds another dimension. Sri Ramakrishna would say, imagine that the soul is like a needle, a metal needle. It naturally feels attracted to a magnet. Imagine God to be an infinitely powerful magnet. Obviously, the needle is going to shoot right to it, right? Why doesn't it? Why doesn't our soul needle flee to, jump right straight to the magnet, the God magnet? Sri Ramakrishna says, because that needle is caked over with many, many layers of dirt, mud, impurity, accumulated over the course of many, many lifetimes. And so the real aim of all spiritual practice, if you were to put it very simply, is chitta shuddhi in Sanskrit. Purification, self-purification. Cleansing ourselves, purifying ourselves of that dirt, of that mud, covering over that needle. And in one place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna puts it very beautifully. He says, what's one of the main spiritual practices for purifying yourself? He says, pray with tears in your eyes. And those tears will wash away the mud covering that soul needle. The tears themselves will wash away the mud. And when that happens, what happens? The soul manifests. And that soul naturally pants for God, naturally longs for God. That's what all the Psalms, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible talk about. As the deer pants for water, right? That's one of the Psalms, which some of these great classical composers have put to music. Sicut servus. The soul naturally feels longing for God. So what's our problem? We don't identify with the soul. We identify with the body-mind complex instead, because of all these impurities. And because what do we do all the time? We're spending most of our time gratifying the body or gratifying the mind, or both at the same time. That's our problem. The more we do that, the more we strengthen our identification with the body-mind complex. Through spiritual practice, genuine spiritual practice, what happens? We gradually erode our identification with the body-mind complex. More and more we start identifying with the deeper soul within, until what happens? One fine day, we realize, wait a minute, we're not body-mind complexes, we're souls. Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel sometimes talks about the chakras, the 6 chakras. And in that context, he says, the first meaningful spiritual realization a spiritual aspirant has is when the mind ascends to the level of the heart chakra. And he explains it very beautifully. He says, when the mind reaches the heart chakra, what's the realization? He says, the spiritual aspirant realizes the Jivatman, directly perceives himself or herself as the Jivatman, as the individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex, in the form of a flame, shikarne, he says in Bengali. It's very, very specific. Shikarne, in the form of a flame, and he has a vision of light, Jyoti Darshan Hai. And then the spiritual aspirant says, what is this? What is this? Eki. It's an astonishing realization. For the first time after millions of lifetimes, we actually directly experience ourselves as souls. It's a tremendous realization. That's a prerequisite for then cultivating genuine longing and bhakti for God. You know who says this? Ramanuja. Not Shankara, who most people are familiar with in Vedanta, but Ramanuja. Ramanuja was a founder of one of the great bhakti schools of Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. And many of us don't know that even the bhakti schools of Vedanta often recommend Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. How many of you know that? Very few, probably. Ramanuja does. And what he does is he turns the tables on Shankara. He says, oh, Shankara, you're saying that bhakti yoga is a preparatory discipline that purifies our mind and makes us eligible to practice the higher path of knowledge, which takes us to the highest goal? Wonderful. let's just reverse that, and then you have the real truth. The preparatory discipline is Jnana Yoga. And he defines Jnana Yoga a bit differently. Ramanuja says, what is Jnana Yoga? He says, constant meditation on your true nature as an individual soul, as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. What's the culmination of this practice of Jnana Yoga? He says you should directly have the spiritual experience of yourself as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. He calls that Atma Avalokanam in Sanskrit. This is what Sri Ramakrishna refers to as bringing the mind up to the heart chakra level and realizing yourself as a Jivatman in the form of a flame. Why does Ramanuja say that's a kind of preparatory discipline for bhakti? Because Ramanuja says you can't feel genuine longing for God, genuine love for God, until you have identified with the deeper soul within. Because the soul already loves God. The soul is already a child of God. The soul already has bhakti for God. Our problem then is that we're not able to identify with the soul. We're identified with the body-mind, which can never have real bhakti. It's not even sentient, for goodness sakes. The body is insentient, but even the mind is insentient from the standpoint of Indian philosophy. It's only the conscious soul that pants and longs for God. So through spiritual practice, we try to break our identification with the body-mind complex, and we eventually will identify with the deeper soul within. And that soul is who believes in God. That soul is that which longs for God. Swami Medhananda one time, he was asked by someone, Swamiji, how do we cultivate bhakti? How do we cultivate bhakti? And he says, you're already bhaktas. You're already a bhakta in your heart. You just don't know it because that bhakti is covered over by all these layers of impurity. Exactly the same thing they're saying here. He says specifically this impurity of lust and greed. So through spiritual practice, remove those impurities. What happens? Your innate bhakti, your innate longing, your innate belief in God will manifest. But it takes a long time, as Swami Medhananda says. And let's not deceive ourselves into thinking that we're already there when we're not. How pure are we really? Where do our minds go most of the time? To worldly things or to God? Or to the higher soul, the self? How many of us can honestly say that 98% of the time, 99% of the time it goes to God? That's the question. So the true test, as I said, that we're at stage 2 rather than stage 1, that we really believe in God, is that we can't even rest because we're just restless for God. We must realize God. We must realize the self. Do we really feel that way? And do we live our lives in accordance with that? Do we think? Do we talk? And do we live in accordance with that belief in God? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Of course, what does that mean? It means most people in the world don't believe in God. Even most spiritual aspirants, most so-called religious people are in fact what Swami Medhananda calls religious atheists. And it should keep us up at night. That's what he wants. He's provocative for a reason, because he was so compassionate and he didn't want us to deceive ourselves. Swami Medhananda used to say, in religious life, 80% are cheats, 15%, there are 3 categories. 80% are cheats, 5% are crazy, and 15%, what's the third category? Why does it slip my mind? Anyone? This is from the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. Hold on. 80% cheats. Okay, it's not coming in. But anyway, for our purposes now, the relevant category is the 80%, the majority. Cheats, because I think that category includes both people who are cheating others. Some people make a profession out of that as so-called spiritual gurus, who are in fact fake gurus, but they make lots of money and they get lots of followers, especially with social media and YouTube now. They can make a killing that way. But there's a more insidious kind of cheating in spiritual life. People who cheat themselves, self-deceivers. That's why the category is so large. A full 80% of spiritual aspirants. Oh, sorry, I was thinking of the wrong. 80% cheats, either cheating others or cheating yourself. 15% go crazy. 5% succeed. That's it. I was barking up the wrong tree with the yeah. So anyway, 15% go crazy. 5% succeed in spiritual life. who are really sincere, who don't cheat themselves, who don't cheat others, who don't go crazy, and ultimately reach the end. So those numbers are daunting, but one thing that should encourage us, in our tradition at least, is that we believe in universal liberation, which means what? Not a single soul will be left out in the end. Every single one of us, as souls, not necessarily in this body-mind, most of us probably not in this life, but eventually, if not in this lifetime, then in a subsequent lifetime. It might take one person 5 lives, another person 100 lives, another person another 1,000 lives. But every single one of us will reach the finish line of this grand spiritual marathon in the end. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If this talk is a little discouraging, it's not meant to be discouraging. Swami Vivekananda, where's he getting this idea that not 1 in 20 million spiritual aspirants genuinely believes in God? From his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. He would quote Sri Ramakrishna himself as saying, not 1 in 20 millions in this world believed in God. This is volume 1, page 407 of the Complete Works. But if you don't believe me or even believe Swami Vivekananda, this is taken directly from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot even believe that God exists until one's heart becomes pure. Antor shuddho na hole ishwar achen bole bishwashi hoy na. Vishvasa, that's the Bengali term for belief here. You cannot believe in God until your heart has become pure. And Swami Vivekananda himself says in an 1887 conversation, just months after Sri Ramakrishna had left his body, he's talking to his brother disciple Prashanna, who would later become Swami Trigunatitanandaji. Swamiji says, so long as one has desires and cravings, one does not believe that God exists. So long as one has desires and cravings, one does not believe that God exists. Jotokkon kamona bashana, totokkon ishwarke abishwash. Hard words, but things that we should really ponder deeply. So I'm a philosopher, and so I can't resist bringing in a little bit of technical philosophy here, just for a moment, so please indulge me. In philosophy, and in the field specifically of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and belief, there's this doctrine called doxastic voluntarism. Doxastic voluntarism sounds fancy, but it's a simple idea. Voluntarism means what? Doing something voluntarily. Doxastic is just the adjective form of doxa, which means belief. So doxastic voluntarism is the view that we can voluntarily adopt beliefs. I can just choose to believe something. Okay, what would be an example? Well, what's the capital of California? Sacramento, right? I know that. What if I just decide to believe that San Francisco is the capital of California? Can I do it? No. If I didn't know that Sacramento was the capital, then I could, right? If I genuinely didn't know what the capital of of California was, and somebody told me, hey, it's San Francisco, don't you know? Then I might believe it. But if I really know that Sacramento is the capital of California, I can't just decide to believe that San Francisco is. Likewise, if my mind revolves constantly around sense pleasures and worldly things just feel more real to me than God does or the higher self does. I can't just decide to believe in God or the higher self. That's the idea. And so most philosophers these days reject doxastic voluntarism. They say this is bogus. It doesn't work. That's not the way that belief formation works. It's not voluntary. It's not in our control. So now, applying this to Swami Vivekananda's picture of the journey of faith, this faith ladder, stage 1, going back to stage 1 briefly, intellectual ascent, that I think Swami Vivekananda would say is voluntary. We can voluntarily assent intellectually to God's existence, because what does that involve? You can arrive at it through deep study. You know, Kant and other, you can study philosophers who you can assess arguments on both sides of the debate, look at arguments for God's existence, look at Richard Dawkins and other arguments against God's existence, think about things for yourself, and then ultimately what happens? You open yourself to the possibility, just at an intellectual level, yeah, it's possible that God exists. The problem of evil is not fatal to God's existence. There are good answers. There are what are called theodicies in philosophy of religion. explaining why God allows all this suffering in all these places like Gaza and these places that we're hearing about daily. Yeah, suffering in itself doesn't rule out the possibility that God exists. A kind of intellectual openness to God's existence, that's voluntary. But belief in God, involuntary. I think Swami Vivekananda will say, with most philosophers, that you can't just choose to believe that God exists. You can't choose to believe anything. It's just, in general, belief formation just doesn't work that way. And especially in the context of believing in God. That belief has to arise spontaneously when the conditions are right. And so us as spiritual aspirants, we as spiritual aspirants, what do? We have to prepare the conditions, lay the groundwork for that belief in God to arise spontaneously in our hearts. That's what we can do. Through what? Through spiritual practice and through sincerity and through trying not to deceive ourselves. Okay. Finally, stage 3. Stage 1, intellectual assent. Stage 2, which most of us haven't reached, faith as genuine belief in God, where we have this tremendous longing to realize God, the divine. What happens ultimately? This belief should culminate in direct spiritual realization. So that's the third and culminating stage in Swami Vivekananda's faith ladder. Even genuine belief is not enough. We need to have direct experiential realization. He says in a lecture aptly titled Realization, delivered in London in 1896, if you have seen a certain country and a man forces you to say that you have not seen it, still in your heart of hearts you know you have. So when you see religion and God in a more intense sense than you see this external world, nothing will be able to shake your belief. Then you have real faith. The language is striking. See, nothing will be able to shake your belief only after you have had direct realization of the divine, which means that even belief is not enough because it's still open to doubt. Look at Sri Ramakrishna during his sadhana period, his period of spiritual practice. If he didn't have longing for God, who did? And yet, this is pre-realization, the first realization. He hadn't yet realized Kali, even though he had more longing than most people in the world. Finally, in anguish, he looks at the idol of Kali, the image of Kali, and says in despair, "Are you just an image of clay, O mother? Or are you real?" He starts to doubt. You see how even belief in God, that of course he was at the second stage, even if he hadn't yet attained realization. But he had doubts at that level. Belief, and yet at the same time, but are you real, O mother? And then he had the realization. It finally took him about to slit his throat, right? You know that incident, right before the first realization. And then he has the realization of mother. He's about to commit suicide. That amount of longing. And then all doubts disappear. And only then, right? That's why the scriptures, again, in the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita talks again and again about how all doubts disappear only upon realization. Vidyate hridaya grante chidyante sarva samshayaha kshiyante chasi karmani tasmin drishte paravare. Mundaka Upanishad. So, where does that leave us as spiritual aspirants? I hope I've already kind of covered this, but I just want to summarize again. Don't despair. Every single one of us will reach the end of this 26.2 mile marathon. Marathon, of course, goes over many lifetimes, so we don't need to reach the goal in this life. Most of us won't reach the goal in this life. Let's not freak out about that. Let's be realistic. Let's try to make as much progress as we can in this life and leave the rest. Do your best and leave the rest. And what are the takeaways here? Number one, we need to be honest with ourselves as spiritual aspirants. We don't necessarily have to be publicly honest with everyone and whatever, but be honest with yourself. Be honest in your meditation room when you're alone with God, alone with yourself, and ask yourself, how much progress have I really made in spiritual life? Do I really believe in God? If not, how do I bring myself into a position to believe that God exists? what do I need to tweak? What do I need to change in my daily life, in my spiritual practice, to intensify my longing for God, my need for God? Yeah. So that's it. I'll leave you with that. Thanks. Oh yeah, now questions. Every center is different. I get confused. Okay, questions.
Just wait for my cookies. And
Two people are going to speak at the same time. Okay, so
no,
thank you
you
very
may
much.
also make an announcement, if you have
What's the
questions in Zoom, just type up your question.
okay, anyone watching online, if you have a question, type it.
Make it short, though.
Please make it short and make sure it's a question and not some kind of observation, and plug it into the live stream. Okay.
To my simple thinking, I can reduce faith to one stage, which is that this is the foundation for all religious beliefs and practices, at least the way I've been raised to think about faith. And also, whether you even give any thought to God whatsoever, you can still evolve spiritually throughout your life. So I don't know, you can place the emphasis on God if you like, based on the context of the religion or practice, but I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, I understood the second point. I didn't understand the first point you were saying.
Well, the first point is that the way I think about it in very simple terms is faith is the foundation. One stage. And if you realize God, that's knowledge, that's not faith.
Right, yeah, I mean, there's a kind of...
I don't use that distinction.
Right, okay. So you're saying faith is belief falling short of realization, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are different views, and philosophers have different kind of takes on faith, and some will have a more static view of faith as one thing. But William James, Swami Medhananda, they understand faith as something that develops and evolves. And yeah, it evolves on my understanding in those three stages: intellectual assent, belief, and realization. But I understand what you're saying. The second point was, remind me again very quickly, because I forgot.
You can evolve spiritually.
Oh yeah, without believing in God. Yeah, yeah.
Without even
So
thinking about or knowing about God.
God, yeah. So
Native.
yeah, I think that's a great point. And so, but the thing is, I think that mutatis mutandis, you know what that term means in Latin? Like changing the relevant thing. So what would be the thing that changed here to still make the argument go through in the case of, let's say, an Advaita Vedantist or a Buddhist who believes in nirvana? So let's first talk about Advaita Vedanta. They don't believe in God necessarily. If you're a real Vedantin, Advaita Vedantin, you should just be practicing Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga is a kind of, you're done with that. That was in a past lifetime. So you don't believe in God, but what do you believe in? You believe in the higher self. Do you really? That's a question we should ask the Neo-Advaitins. How many of you really believe that you are the self, you are non-dual pure consciousness separate from the body-mind complex? Can you honestly say that you do? And that you really live your life in accordance with that belief? Probably not. So that's why I say that I think you can apply the same kind of argument, just changing the term God to higher self, nirvana. So for Buddhists, do you really believe that through the cessation of thirst, trishna, that you can attain a state of nirvana? If so, then why are you behaving this way? Same question. So I think that if we just, but thank you for kind of pressing me on that, because that should have been part of my talk, actually, broadening this to expand it beyond just theism, belief in God. It's very good. Yeah, and I think Geeta had a question, then we'll come back to, yeah.
You talked about Vishwas being faith, and then there's the term Shraddha. And it seems like that highest stage of faith is really Shraddha. And then, well, I guess there's two parts of this. There was Vishwas, but also, like even Advaita Vedanta makes Shraddha as a prerequisite for even practicing.
It's one of the 6 treasures, yeah.
So if you have to have Shraddha to practice, but you have to have realization to get Shraddha, we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, but that's why I would probably not define the term so rigidly. And so what I would say is, first of all, she's mentioning 2 terms in Bengali, Bishas and Shraddha. Bishas, Vishvasa in Sanskrit. I think that the better way to translate that would just be belief. Notice that from the quotations I read in the talk today, So Sri Ramakrishna says, you cannot have bishash in God, you cannot believe in God until your heart becomes pure. And then Swami Vivekananda says, so long as you have worldly desires and attachments, you can't, tatokon obishash, you don't have bishash, belief. I think the simplest, most kind of common translation of the term bishash in Bangla would be belief, not necessarily faith. So faith is more capacious, I think, because it can include belief, but it's not limited to belief. It can also include intellectual assent at an earlier stage, and it can also, now arguably, it can include realization. Some people say then that's not faith anymore. But now, another thing is the term faith, even in English, has different connotations and meanings. So there's faith that God exists. That's one kind of understanding of faith, faith as belief. But there's also faith in God in the sense of what? Trust. That's a very common understanding of faith, actually. Do you trust in God? Do you trust God? Do you have that feeling of surrender toward God? That's also faith, right? And so maybe when Swamiji is saying real faith, at the highest, real faith is realization, in the sense that you can't genuinely surrender to God, you can't truly trust in God and God alone. Like the baby kitten in Sri Ramakrishna's favorite analogy. Just sitting there saying mew mew and waiting for mother cat to take her in her mouth and plop her somewhere else. Most of us aren't there yet. We need the realization to have that genuine state of surrender. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Intellectual assent, many people, especially some gurus, I would call them pretendanandas. Yeah?
Pretendanandas, I've never heard that. That's good.
Walking with
Okay.
eyes glazed, speaking slowly. But my question is,
And with a long beard, you need the beard. Yeah. Okay.
my question is, where's the role of experience? Because I do a lot of yoga festivals, events. The current trend is plant medicine, grandmother, that's the threshold guardian in the hero's journey. Many young people are into this yogis, yoga teacher training is offered, and they are able to experience the divine. They get a taste. So I'm saying things are evolving. What's the Vedantic perspective?
Yeah, I think the current situation is both promising and dangerous. Let me put it that way. It's promising for the reasons you say. Meditation apps are proliferating. Spirituality has become almost kind of popular. If on a dating site you can say that you're not just a business geek or a hiker, but you also, are spiritual but not religious or something. Yeah, you'll find more partners that way, probably. It's the in thing now to be spiritual. Fortune 500 companies all have these, like, what do you call them? Any of you seen the HBO show Silicon Valley? There's a send up of this. It's like a googly type company which has this Indian fake guru kind of thing, advising the CEOs and with these ridiculous, bombastic kind of pseudo spiritual statements. And so all that's true. That's the promising side of it. But at the same time, the danger is everything has just become too easy and commercialized, and it's so easy for capitalism to just co-opt spirituality back into itself. Adorno talks about this. I studied German philosophy, and capitalism is insidious, and it can market anything and turn everything into a commodity. Spirituality has become a kind of commodity. And there are people who make not just a living, but make millions and billions of dollars from spirituality as a commodity. And so it's almost too easy to be spiritual these days. And that's dangerous. And what's another easy way to be spiritual? Taking a psychedelic. And I'm not saying that it's never useful in spiritual life. So I don't want you to think that. But it's a spiritual shortcut. And there's a real danger in relying too heavily on drug use. There's so many different shortcuts that people are exploring. Another shortcut, Neo-Advaita. Drop all the spiritual prerequisites, the sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana I was talking about, viveka, vairagya, shatsampa, and just skip all the bhakti, the pesky stuff like purifying the mind. Who needs a pure mind? You're not the mind. And so who cares about whether the mind is pure or impure? You're the ever free, ever pure self. So just dive into the Atman. I say this from personal experience. Why? Because when when I first moved to India to become a monk, I did a 6-month pilgrimage, and I went to a place called Kodaikanal in Tamil Nadu, a beautiful hill station in the mountains. And I walk into a bakery, and I'm wearing this kind of clothes except in white, because I wasn't a sannyasi yet, obviously. I hadn't joined the order yet. And the baker woman there, who presumably owned the place, middle-aged woman, she looked at me and she said, what are you up to? I said, well, I'm planning on joining the Ramakrishna mission. I'm going to train to be a sannyasi, this, that. She goes, oh, why go to all that trouble? See, I'm a follower of Ramana Maharshi, and he taught us to dive into the Atman. So why don't you just dive into the Atman? So again, it's not, Ramana Maharshi could dive into the Atman, no doubt. And we all want to believe that we're Ramana Maharshis. In the gospel, I was just reading, I read gospel at bedtime, and yesterday I read this passage about Sri Ramakrishna says, all of you talk about being King Janakas. But how much austerity did King Janaka have to perform? Janaka is a famous householder king who also realized God. Bhoga and yoga, enjoyment and renunciation and liberation. He says, do you know how many lifetimes of spiritual practice that King Janaka engaged in order to be in his position, to be a king, rule over the world, and at the same time have his mind constantly on God? Is it such a joke? So anyway, that's a long answer, but that's the danger, yeah.
Related question, and by the way, I'm with you about Chief Bishop, we totally agree. The other thing I'm noticing just from experience is everyone is into big rocks in the sky, the planets, especially with the eclipse tomorrow, the Mercury retrograde. That's huge in spirituality, and that appears to like almost overshadow the desire for God. You know?
Oh, you mean astrology also? Astrology. Is that? Yeah. No, I mean, look, I believe in astrology. I think there are fake astrologers. I think there are real astrologers, and I think that planets can influence human behavior. I think it's, in fact, the very fact that the moon can affect the tides, for instance, is that's something that seems hard to believe. To the point where Sri Ramakrishna asked M, how is that even possible? How does that work? And then M started explaining it by sketching on the ground in the sand, and Sri Ramakrishna, stop, my head is spinning. So anyway, that's another aside. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, astrology. But if you just do a couple Google searches on astrology, what do you find? People who are obsessed with astrology tend to be weak-minded. Obsessed, believing in astrology is one thing, but spending your every waking moment figuring out what period you're in and how to pacify Rahu by wearing this gem on your wrist and for this amount of time, which obviously is going to be very expensive. So again, capitalism co-opting spirituality. You have to buy this $5,000 diamond in order to mitigate the effects of Rahu from this period to this period. Look, I'm not even saying that it's not true, but who is more powerful than these gems? God. But instead of relying on God to mitigate the bad effects of Rahu, we're thinking of these insentient stones and gems and this and going to this astrologer and that psychic and this. That's why I say weak-minded. That's why Swami Medhananda would never encourage this stuff. He never denied that this stuff could be true and that it probably is true. It's all just different ways of distributing karma. That's all it is. We accrued karma based on what we did in our previous lives. How does that manifest to us? Through these planetary influences and all sorts of other stuff. Yes, sure. Does that mean that we should obsess about what gems to wear and then what position this planet's in? No, let's obsess about God. Thank you.
So what about experiences that happen prior to realization? I call them breadcrumbs.
Breadcrumbs. Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So just kind of show you the path. And in my own experience, it eliminates doubt. There is something more real than this.
Okay. Oh, I see. In that sense, that's interesting.
So where would those breadcrumbs be on your ladder? Where would they go place?
Yeah. Chapter 6 of an earlier book I published called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I distinguish between spiritual experiences that are self-authenticating from those that are not. Philosophers talk about these things. And I take Sri Ramakrishna's view to be that only the highest final spiritual experience is self-authenticating, by which I mean that the experience itself guarantees to the experiencer that God exists or the self exists, whatever it is the object of the experience, the content of the experience. But that any other spiritual experience that falls short of that highest realization is not self-authenticating, which means that there's always some room for doubt. You can be subjectively absolutely convinced, have 100% subjective conviction, but that doesn't translate into 100% objective conviction until you attain the highest spiritual realization. That's the way I see it. But does that mean that the breadcrumbs aren't valuable? Of course they are. They're very helpful. As long as they're genuine breadcrumbs and we're honest with ourselves. I mean, I really do think that it's easy for people to mistake an emotional, a heightened state of emotion for a genuinely spiritual experience. It also depends on how broadly you define the term spiritual experience. But if you define it in a kind of rigorous way as making objective contact with or gaining direct experiential knowledge of a transcendental reality, a transcendental truth, whether you call that God, the divine, the self, then are these breadcrumbs spiritual experiences in that sense? That's up to each person having the breadcrumbs to decide. But as I said, the ego is deeply invested in making us think that we've already had spiritual experiences that we haven't really had. And then that's a way of short-circuiting our spiritual life. And so, yeah, it's possible. And Sarvapriyanji, in an Advaita Vedanta context, you talk about breadcrumbs, he talks about the breakthrough. There's a kind of breakthrough. That's not full-blown self-realization, but it's a kind of prelude to that. And he says that, as far as I remember in his Ask Swami, some of these sessions, he seems to say that, look, self-realization is a very, very high ideal, but the breakthrough is more accessible. How accessible, I don't know. But anyway, that's what I understood him as saying.
In terms of the latter, I understand it's not ultimate realization because it's not.
Oh, I see. Where do the breadcrumbs fit in the stages? Maybe like kind of toward the end of stage one, like it's those breadcrumbs that help pole vault us from stage one to stage two, possibly. You might even get some breadcrumbs in stage two. But I would say most of the breadcrumbs that I hear these days are more stage one breadcrumbs. Yeah. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Yeah.
There's a question.
Yeah. Okay, so there's an online question. We'll take that first and then.
Okay, Ram asks, you mentioned you cannot choose to believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if you believe God is sending you guidance, but then you are misguided in your belief?
Yeah. What happens if you believe that God is guiding you, but you are misguided in your belief, right? Yeah. Well, what does it mean to be misguided? You can try to believe that God is guiding you. I think that's just, if we just add the word try before the believe, then we become a sincere spiritual aspirant at stage one. Do you see what I mean? It's not like a huge, fundamental difference. A sincere spiritual aspirant will think about God, try to believe in God. Notice I said try. Will try to engage in spiritual practices, will try to lead a God-centered life. You see what I mean? Try to feel as if God is guiding them at every step of the way. Try to feel. So no need to feel like you're being misguided. It can be, that's very, very helpful as a spiritual practice. That's an aspect of bhakti practice. Bhakti yoga is to actually feel that God is guiding you. But this is a feeling that falls short of genuine belief for most people. So how do you then cultivate genuine belief? Keep trying to believe that God is guiding you at every step. Blaise Pascal, the great scientist who became a great Christian thinker, he had this collection of notes which were called pensées, thoughts. And there he says, even if you don't believe in God, first of all, there's this famous Pascal's wager argument. Have any of you heard of it, Pascal's wager? So he says, make a wager. And he says, what would a rational bettor do? On the one hand, if God exists and you don't believe in God and you don't live your life in a God-centered way, what happens? You go straight to hell because he's a Catholic. So that's not a very good outcome. Let's say God does not exist. But What does that mean? You live your life you try to live it in a God-centered way. You go to church and you pray to God. What do you lose? You lose some worldly enjoyments, but not much worse than that. It's a finite loss. But an infinite gain in the chance that God actually exists infinitely outweighs the finite loss that of the worldly enjoyments that you get from. Anyway, that's Pascal's wager. Now, on the basis of that, he then says, so you should believe in God. Then he raises a really interesting point. He says, but I know some of you are saying, I can't just believe that God exists. How do I do that? Very much in the vein of Swami Medhananda. So what does he say? Very interesting. Pascal says, if you don't believe, go to church, bend your knee at the time of prayer, worship, pray, and eventually you will believe. And eventually you will believe. Exactly like Vivekananda. This is a few centuries before Vivekananda. But Pascal says the same thing. If you don't yet believe, go through the motions of believing. Not go through the motions sounds bad, but engage sincerely in spiritual practices. And what will happen? Eventually that belief in God will spontaneously arise. Thank you. And somebody, yeah.
Can you make belief in God a placebo effect?
Can you elaborate what you mean?
Well, that's kind of like Pascal's, description. Fake it until you make it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's it.
So
that's
it's
it.
that's the
Yeah.
placebo,
Oh, I see.
believe
Well,
in
okay,
it
that
and
was
it
confusing.
works.
But fake it till you make it is a better way of putting it, I think. That's it. Yeah. Fake it till you make it. Pascal / Vivekananda. Today's imagination is tomorrow's reality. Is that? Yeah. Realization. Yeah. 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 Just let's try to avoid deceiving ourselves. That's the only thing.
I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
As somebody that thinks that I'm farther along than I am, definitely in the
See, but that's honest right there. See? That means you're probably farther along than you are. Okay, anyway.
As you were talking about the religious atheist, the thing that came to my mind, kind of an extreme example would be that final scene in the movie The Godfather, where he's at the baptism and Michael Corleone is saying, I renounce Satan, and then, at the time he's ordering essentially.
Right, that's beautiful, yeah, yeah.
But my question is, as I go through my own process, the thing that always keeps me from higher spiritual practice is that it's a trade-off. And so I have what I perceive today to be this benefit of the material life, and there's a fear then that giving up some part of this existence will be worse than what And so I guess my question is, as two people who have renounced, how much renunciation is required to advance? How much do we have to trade off in order to give up? And that's a fear-based question.
Ha 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 ha.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. I think what you're saying, first of all, is that the ideal, the spiritual ideal, just seems so far off or somehow intangible that the safe route is, this is real, these worldly enjoyments, and so let's cling to these, and because the trade-off is sort of, it's not worth it in a way, until we really feel that the goal is realizable and practicable in a way. You're asking about us. I mean, look, there's renunciation. We're all on the path. I think he and I will both admit we're in stage 1. I'm going to speak for myself. I'm stage 1. I'm trying to live my life in a way that will help me to get to a point where that belief in God will arise. That's what I can say. And there are varying degrees of sincerity among monks too, and not all monks are alike. And so how much is the question, how much renunciation is necessary?
More like natural renunciation, probably what he says. On the path, we talked about more on love of God. So renunciation is more of a natural byproduct of your love for God. So when you start to value more quietness, when you start to value more the inner life within yourself, the feeling of that, when you start to value more of the peace that you're getting from your practices, as you start to get these qualities, the spiritual qualities in your practices, you start to let go naturally of other things that take you away, right? So the idea is that Sri Ramakrishna says, as you head north, as you head west, you start to see east, So renunciation, we emphasize, is more of a natural byproduct of the things you love. Once you love this, you can automatically let go the things that are taking you away from that. That's the idea. It's not forced renunciation. It's just the natural. It's like something comes naturally.
Yeah, Sri Ramakrishna used to say in Bangla, "Bhoganto na hole tag ashena." Until you have passed through the end of enjoyments, you won't feel that true spirit of renunciation. And so there's one path, which is the monastic route, where, of course, we also follow that dictum. How do we do it? We went through those experiences in previous lives. If we didn't marry in this life, we did it in the previous life, right? I mean, so nobody escapes that logic, the logic of experience. But for many people in this life, it involves having to pass through certain experiences once or twice or a certain number of times, learn from those experiences, and then we'll just feel like, wait a minute, we didn't get out of that experience what we were looking for. That's why Swami Medhananda used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. So we can all, let's try to learn from our experiences. I think that's what we should try to do. We should experience mindfully so that we can get out of the experience what we need to get out of it. Ask ourselves, what were we looking for out from this experience? Now that we've had the experience, did we get out of it what we were looking for? Usually the answer is no. What happens when we are honest with ourselves about that? That natural renunciation that Mara is talking about, that starts to come. That's the way I see it.
Last question.
Mike, please.
So you mentioned sadhana chatushtaya, the four prerequisites, and when I read those, it's like, those don't seem like prerequisites to me. It's like, if you've really got dispassion, discrimination, all those things, you're kind of there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, they're super high level, right? Is that what you mean? They're very high level attainments in a way. Yeah. Yeah, but that's the thing. I mean, this is Advaita Vedanta that we're talking about, the fourfold qualifications. It's not for bhakti. It's for people who think that they're qualified to practice the path of knowledge. Shankara says it very clearly in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 1.1.1, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. He says nobody is qualified to tread on the path of knowledge unless they are fully equipped with the fourfold sadhana. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says, so long as you are identified with the body and you feel the body's pain as your own, you are not eligible to practice Advaita Vedanta. And therefore, the path of this age, of this Kali Yuga, in which people are so body conscious, is the path of bhakti. That's why it's better and safer and more honest for the vast majority of us to be practicing bhakti rather than the path of knowledge. Because we don't need to have those super high level qualifications to just, you know the beauty of bhakti? Just think about it this way. Let's say we have 1% viveka, 2% vairagya, almost none of the 6 treasures, 0 longing. Even then, bhakti yoga is a path for you. Now I'm a salesman for bhakti. Why? Because all you have to do is pray to God. And literally, Sri Ramakrishna, he gives us those examples in the gospel. He says, oh Lord, I am completely devoid of any kind of spiritual practice. He literally, bhajanhin, shadonhin. I don't know how to call on you. You don't feel real to me. You complain. Tell God, confess to God your own weaknesses, your own inability. I'm stuck in stage 1. Help me, God. And God will help you. Who else will help you but God? That's the beauty of bhakti. You can be the least qualified person in the world. You're still eligible for bhakti. Actually, if you're honest about being the least eligible person in the world, you're already on the path of bhakti, and you're making progress in the path of bhakti. That's the beauty of it. Being honest about your weaknesses is a tremendously powerful bhakti practice. If you're honest with yourself and with God, confessing to God is itself a very powerful bhakti practice. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you, everyone.